Welcome to the show. The main intention of this podcast is to discover perspectives, information, and wisdom that would not be accessible otherwise. Many interviews today offer little variety in guests or viewpoints, which I'm hoping to at least partially change. That being said, you, the listener, are going to be appreciating a relatively normal person during a normal conversation, so be nice. In the description of the podcast, I will do my best to link any relevant media we reference throughout. We are not checking live every fact or figure that we mention, so if we miss something, please email us at romanwanderings@gmail.com with specific corrections, and at the top of the next episode, we will rectify any gaffes we may have made. You can also email us if you have any comments or interest in being interviewed yourself. I can't guarantee every email will warrant an interview, but if you plead your case well with good prose, I can most certainly be persuaded. My guest today is Matt Horjar, and again, that email is romanwanderings@gmail.com. You're listening to the Roaming Wandering podcast. Sit down, relax, enjoy the sultry tones of Roman Nardone and whatever guests decided to show up that day.
So, how you doing today, man?
I'm great, man. How are you doing?
Doing well.
I guess this is the second episode of the Roaming Wanderings podcast, where we talk about perspective, understanding, and whatever comes to our minds. For corrections today, I'm going to try to do this at the top of every episode, is we kind of just talk about and review what we had mentioned last podcast and make sure that we aren't lying too much on here. And the only major one I had was, I don't know if you remember me talking about them putting lead in gasoline or not.
Yeah, I remember. In relation to the spikes in crime or the relative decrease in crime.
Yeah, exactly. I said that they had taken the lead out in 1977, but they actually took the lead out in 1996, which is actually kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Because it's literally 20 years after I had said, which means that, an extra 20 years, that lead just gets embedded in everything,
Right. I mean, we were babies at that time. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. I like to think that I'm a full functioning human, but it's hard to say.
It's all relative.
Right. I mean, even fucking like lead in paint and toys and things like that.
Right. It's a whole joke about eating the paint chips.
Right, exactly. So it's hard to gauge how rational and how fully developed humans really are in this modern age. Do you have any points of correction you'd like to make from the previous podcast?
Not off the top of my head. If I think of any, if they come up, I'll include them later on, maybe as an addendum.
Sure. One of our listeners did mention the fact that the vitamin D deficiency conversation that we had with black people, that not only are they less likely to have resources to get prescriptions and have an ability to get vitamin D supplements, but they also are less likely to be trustworthy generally of medical workers because of previous history of discrimination and racism from the medical system. So I'm not going to get too into that because that was kind of more of a previous podcast point, but just thought I'd mention it because there's kind of, it's a multifaceted situation that, we kind of need to be aware of. It's just one aspect of a multifaceted problem that needs to be addressed.
Did you have any other corrections or?
No. No, I think that was kind of all that I wanted to mention. I also just want to mention that any notes or any articles, anything that we mentioned of media is going to be in the description. So if you have a question of legitimacy of any of the points that we make, we are going to try to list any of our sources. feel free to email us at the top of the podcast. I will have our email for this podcast listed, so feel free to shoot us something if you have a question or comment, concern, anything like that.
For sure. And also to the listener, I appreciate you guys sitting and or standing or working, driving, and giving this a listen, giving this a shot. We're both brand new at this. We're excited to see how it's going to go and what direction this can go in. It's just the internet in general, people sharing ideas. It's very important to try to get your ideas heard, I think.
Yeah, it's fun to do. From just the little bit that I've done, it just has been a fun little outlet to have creative processes. So recommend people out there to kind of, if you have some sort of hobby, to sort of get invested and do something, because your main gig, if you have a main gig, might not always be the thing that you're well known for, and if you kind of are able to hone other skills outside of just working your 9 to 5, it'll probably make you a more well-rounded person.
Yeah, happier person too. Definitely.
Oh, 100%. Yeah,
definitely.
Part of the reason why I wanted to do this is it seemed like fun to focus yourself and try to segment an amount of time where you really are trying to get like some sort of media across.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of a right. It's free speech.
Yeah,
it kind of ties in on what this country, like the ideals. Like, we don't have to get into what this country was founded on, but the ideals, that were put forth.
No, I mean that's like half of what, like Ben Franklin, who never was a president or anything. The reason why he's well known is because he had a printing press, so he was able to extol some of the virtues and perspectives and ideals that he had to the general masses, which is pretty interesting.
That is.
Yeah. The internet, a lot of people argue, is the next printing press.
Yeah, for sure. It already has been, I think. I mean, think about it before. What handwritten books were probably, if there was one of those and there was 100 of them for every printing press, maybe, give or take, maybe 1,000. And then you take that and you multiply it by like 100,000. It's just exponential. Like, there's no way I'd be reading the New York Times if I didn't have an internet, or like the Guardian, or wherever you want to get your news from.
When I was a kid, I always thought it was odd that people would read a paper based from a location like New York. I was like, oh, why don't we read for Pittsburgh or something?
Yeah, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Yeah, most distinguished writers would end up around New York, is just an indication that, the larger the city, the more hustle, more bustle, the more experience a lot of these writers get. And the fact that you can get that anywhere is pretty exciting for everyone to bring their perspective to another level,
Yeah, it was definitely a hub of ideas. But that's something interesting that's been changing too, like the centralization to New York. Like, if you wanted to work for a newspaper, I'm sure there's other ones. We'll use the New York Times as like the archetype. But yeah, it had to be centralized there if you wanted to work for somebody, like you said, with that the budget. I'm sure living in a big city, you sell more newspapers, and therefore you can afford to pay more on stories, send people places. That's probably how they were able to kind of get that clout. And then I guess the clout, for lack of a better word, of working for the New York Times.
Yeah, and
with the internet,
The only other thing I was going to say is that before, because I kind of see where you're going, because I kind of agree that there is a shifting tide. I just want to kind of extol the virtues of what cities offer, because I think that it kind of was a kind of a new gear shift in the ways that communities interact. So with cities, you can actually gauge how many people live in a city just by how quickly people walk around that city.
I've heard people in New York walk fast. Mm-hmm. Is that like a study you're referencing, or is it like just a fun fact?
No, that is like 100% a study.
Right on.
There was Freakonomics is a podcast I regularly listen to, and they had a podcast specifically talking about cities and how the culmination of people not only just allows for more sharing of information between people, but it almost actually raises the abilities of everyone within that city as well. And they kind of mentioned the fact that there are more Nobel Peace Prize winners in New York per capita than anywhere else. It has nothing to do with the density of the city. It's just the fact that there is a kind of a zeitgeist or a brain sharing of ideas that allows for multiple people to kind of get inspiration and take an idea and run with it, where if you have a small city, there are just not going to be as many astrophysicists, for example, in that community to bounce ideas off of.
Do you think that might tie into why rent prices are so high? I mean, they assume that people there are getting paid more for their work, and I mean, like idealistically, that would be reflecting that they do a better job or more important job. Like, not just anybody can really like afford an apartment in New York City. It's like 3 times what I'd pay in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I think
for the same property.
Yeah, theoretically, the cost of living should be relative to how much you make. And yeah, you would think that in terms of economics, the cost of rent should still be about the third of your income regardless of where you live. I don't know how that I know that we had kind of talked about last time that there is a big wage disparity that's happening. So I don't know if that makes as much sense now, especially in cities like LA and New York. But because you used to be able to move to New York, there is a wage disparity that's increasing. So originally it made sense to move to a large city like LA or New York because the cost of living there would not outweigh the income and network connections that you would make from living there. But now I think, like we had just mentioned, there is kind of a diaspora of minds that's happening currently in the United States, which is kind of interesting.
Now, by diaspora, you mean the same thing as decentralization?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like an outpouring. Mm-hmm. Is that what that refers to?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought so. Yeah, and I mean, people don't for the reasons the economic reasons. It's not really someone can just save up and move to New York. Mm-hmm. They can, but it's a riskier decision that I'm sure it has been in the past.
I mean, there are still professions that require you to move to high population areas just because your job kind of requires that. But because a lot of
even in that case, people will sometimes have to rent an apartment or buy a house or whatever, an hour away from where they work and then commute every day.
Yep.
And no one wants to do that.
So I think what we're kind of both highlighting is the fact that because of the large fires that have been happening lately and because of COVID, there's a lot of people leaving the California area, and in particular it seems like people are moving to Austin and some of the smaller cities that are well known to be hip but not as populated. So it's going to be interesting to see in the next 5 to 10 years how those cities start to build up.
It will be. I mean, Austin is already a pretty big city to begin with.
Well, I mean, it's nothing compared to New York or LA, though.
Good point.
So,
yeah,
I mean,
that'll be
a lot of internet-based countries internet-based companies are trying to diversify so that if you don't have to be in a really expensive city, if you're the most expensive part of your organization is bandwidth rather than rent, why wouldn't you try to move somewhere that you can lower some of the costs and still be able to offer whatever service or product you're creating?
100%. I mean, if it's something that you do on a computer, very few good reasons I can see that, like, you couldn't do it from home. One of which I understand would be like cybersecurity. I know a lot of companies want their employees to like only use work computers whenever they're dealing with business files for that reason, so that they can keep them secure on their own system. And yeah, if you work from home, you can get a VPN and do that all securely, but is it foolproof? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people are getting tech savvy with some of that stuff because of COVID. A lot of people are working from home. Probably 30 to 50% more people are on the internet than ever have been before, working from home. So I think that's kind of changing the ways that people look at their work.
It should, and it kind of sucks that it took a whole
global health pandemic.
Yeah. But I mean, it happened at least.
Yeah.
People are at least talking about it, looking at it.
I think that there's going to be a rebound of people recognizing the fact that we still need to have people around us, because just being on the computer and never leaving your house is not actually really healthy for your mental health.
You're right, but I've also worked in an office environment where you go to work, you go to your cubicle, and you're just in your cubicle.
Yeah, you don't really socialize.
Away from everyone all day, and they're all working on their stuff, and it's kind of antisocial anyway. Right. And I would rather do that from the comfort of my own home overall. But again, yeah, it's just natural for humans to be social and want to be around other people.
Yeah, theoretically, you would want an office where people are actually having like a community together, but I'm sure there are definitely jobs that are less ideal in the working drone situation that kind of surmises from corporate America.
Yeah. But, it pays. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to have stuff outside of work, not just be coming home and being so tired from work and not really passionate about anything else.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good. It's great to be passionate about what you do, and I hope everyone kind of strives to do that. But
100%.
You also have to pay your bills, so you have to kind of hybrid yourself. Yeah. So, I mean, a little bit about myself. I was semi-interested in computer science, and then found that computer science wasn't really the route to go down for me. Being a fourth child, I found that I'm more social than antisocial. I was surprised to find that I was way more extroverted than I realized when I would try to type out whatever program and find myself antsy and wanting to talk to someone about what's going on. So I wanted to have those same problem solving skills, but then ultimately expand into something that would one-on-one help people and interact with people. And so I kind of used those problem solving skills to pivot into the medical field. And I would argue that radiology and ultrasound, which is what I do now, uses those same skills of problem solving and pattern recognition to help people determine what's going on inside their bodies. Yeah,
that's cool, man. I don't know if I've ever heard you express that like in those words before, and that makes total sense knowing you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually, it kind of seems like sometimes I was practicing a podcast by working with patients, because I would say probably ultrasound is the longest form of radiology imaging that you can get sometimes, depending where you're actually interacting with a patient. Most exams, like X-ray, CT, MRI, you're going to be in like some sort of metal tube that's away from the tech, and they usually have some sort of lead apron on, or some sort of wall between you and them, and they're talking to you through a microphone. But with ultrasound, the tech is hands-on with that person, where you're kind of getting really, really intimate with them in some circumstances. So you kind of have to be able to communicate with them properly and kind of get to know them if you want to make it through the day without feeling really drained, from my perspective anyway.
I'm sure it makes it a lot easier from their perspective also. Like,
exactly.
I would rather, if the guy's talking and happy, it makes me think like, oh, okay, this isn't the worst case scenario. You know, like, he's not dead silent, dead serious.
And they try to get information out of me, and I try to be honest with them and tell them, I don't make those calls because, in some ways I can assist the radiologist in determining what is happening, but they also always have the final call. So I can say it looks like something, but at the end of the day, they make those calls, and I prefer it that way because
less liability.
There's less liability, and I don't mind that at all. I view myself as the photographer, not as the IT diagnoser.
Yeah.
And
that's a nice position to be in.
Yeah,
for sure.
Exactly. And I always enjoyed photography, so it seems fitting that I would kind of be a professional photographer. Mind you, a medical photographer, but I think that they actually do kind of go hand in hand and have very similar attributes or traits.
I'm sure. I mean, you don't have to worry about lighting because it's inside the person. I'm sure.
You actually
like the angles.
Yeah, I mean, like.
Or do you?
Lighting is a relative term. If someone is larger, for example, and they have more fat tissue, adipose tissue, then it's going to be harder for the sound waves to get to whatever you're trying to look at. So in some ways, you could argue that when they're larger, then it's darker, quote unquote, because you're not getting as many sound waves down there, so it's harder to see what you're looking at.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah, so we can reduce the amount of sound waves that go down. So the average probe has a range of 2 megahertz to 6 megahertz. So if someone is really skinny, we are at 6 megahertz, and if they're pretty large, we go all the way down to 2 megahertz. And the reason why we do that is that the higher the frequency, the more likely the sound waves are going to get absorbed by the body. So if it's the lower frequency, then the sound waves move less fast, and so they're more likely to bounce back and give us more information. But it's usually less detailed information. It's like the difference between a HD video and a standard definition, for example.
Does it do you deal in pixelations, like 180p versus 4K, or not in those terms?
Yeah, not in those terms. It just sort of we talk about resolution, so in a way, yes, but it's harder to compare in terms of like 1080 versus like 240 or whatever, because sound waves are analog, so the analog has to get converted into a digital wave, so it's harder to compare what a high quality analog to digital looks like compared to a lower quality analog to digital, and how that compares.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my brain around that right now. Makes sense. So basically, the strength of the wave will come back as an intensity of a color, or
yes,
is it?
Yes.
It's just black and white. So
intensity of black or white. Yes. So it's
okay.
The brighter something is, the more likely that the sound waves hit that thing and bounce back into the probe. So then the machine translate that as there is something that is echogenic, or is more likely to receive echoes at that location. And then if something passes right through it and there's not a lot of bouncing back of anything within that, then it will be seen as dark because there isn't anything that reflects back in that area.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to describe on a podcast, but I might link some stuff that kind of gives people an idea of what I'm talking about. It's very similar to radar technology.
And so you're saying if it doesn't bounce back, it comes back as dark, and that's kind of where you were saying if there's a lot of adipose tissue, it'll be dimmer because the signal will be weakened on the way in, right?
Yeah.
So there'll be less chance
that it'll bounce
chance
back.
That the signal is like a false negative.
Right.
Almost.
Exactly.
Okay.
It'll go
That makes
through,
total
like,
sense.
for example, like if it say at 15 centimeters, there's a lot of fat tissue. So the sound waves will hit all that fat tissue and say half of it will bounce off. So then it'll tell them like, oh, there's a lot of fat here. But then say the other half tries to keep penetrating through. Fat is like really good at absorbing like energy. So then that other half will get absorbed by the rest of the fat tissue and it won't bounce back at all. And so the machine will say, oh, there's no echoes here. So we're just going to say that there's no detail here, or it's really dark here because it's not getting any information.
Huh. Yeah, I can see that would probably be difficult, especially with people who tend to have more adipose tissue, also correlating with being a population more susceptible to certain medical problems.
100%.
Yeah.
That's personally why I enjoy doing ultrasounds of transplanted tissues and things like that, because usually the transplanted tissue is like pretty superficial, so you can see it pretty clearly, and you can look at all of the vasculature of that organ and really get to understand how the organ functions, which is fascinating to me personally.
So whenever you're viewing it, you take the pictures, but the screen you're viewing it on is kind of in real time, right?
100%.
Oh, cool. So like you could even see like the pulsing of the veins, say like through the kidney or something.
Exactly.
Oh, that does sound really cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I had a question about your line of work, since we're kind of on the topic of what we do for a living at the moment.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm sure we'll probably have similar conversations to this. So when you do studies revolving around neurology, are you mostly kind of looking at behavioral studies? Are you looking at cellular chemistry, biology, at the neuron level? Is it kind of a combination of those things?
So it depends on the lab. The lab I'm currently looking in is looking mainly at behavior, backed up with cellular protein expression level. The lab I used to work in looked a lot at like protein expression and cell morphology backed up with behavior. So currently I'm doing more from a behavioral standpoint. But yeah.
Do you need more controls in terms of rat studies with behavior?
It's hard to say more controls, but yeah, it's harder to tease out an effect from behavior.
Right, exactly.
And yeah, so you have to statistically power it, significantly or, adequately. So yeah, I'm not totally not up to date, but I'm not like at a PhD level with statistics.
Right.
But there is a whole field. There's actually a society for it. It's called the Society for the Quantitative Analysis of Behavior. And these people have just made mathematical equations that examine how to measure certain behavioral constructs, like say a rat's preference for conditioned stimuli that are associated with drug use. And they can just plot them logarithmically on these graphs and stuff, and that's the kind of stuff you'll see in scientific papers. But yeah,
statistics get pretty funky pretty quickly from my very cursory understanding of statistics. I think it's fascinating, and I would love to understand more of it, but a lot of times it is counterproductive to how you think the world operates.
It can be, yeah, and you could run the same experiment, get the same results, but if you analyze it wrong for that certain model, then you could just wind up getting a false positive or a false negative, and it does get pretty tricky, especially when it comes to behavior, because it's such nuanced constructs that we're looking at.
So, question for you: I have heard that there has been a crisis of replication, and I think it somewhat revolves around P hacking, or I don't know if these are two separate crises that are happening or if they're related in some way, but I've heard that there's issues of replication in a lot of behavioral studies, and I kind of wanted your perspective on that, or if you kind of had any information on that.
So I don't really have any insider information on that. I'm like familiar with what you're talking about, like P as in referring to statistical significance. So whenever you will analyze it, like take all your numbers, put them in this model of statistical analysis, and you want to see if your experimental group had an effect that was not expected if there was no effect. So what you're referring to, the P represents a number that represents that something has an effect versus a control group where you haven't experimentally manipulated it. So if the P is say like 0.04, then that means that it has a 0.04 chance or a 4% or no, it's a 0.04% chance, I believe.
Oh wow. Okay.
You could check that of happening if there was no effect. So people usually will set P to like P being less than 0.05. And so if you analyze your stuff and it comes back 0.03, then you can say, yes, there was an effect that is statistically significant.
Gotcha.
Now,
so you're kind of like
what
trying
you were
to
saying with
like, sorry, I just want to clarify real quick.
Yeah.
So you're kind of trying to create a barrier to eliminate any noise that might come from your sample.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're kind of like putting a filter through your information so that you don't even have to sift through too much if it's below a certain threshold.
Right. If it's below the certain threshold, then that's what it is. And if it's not, then, well, that's the problem you're talking about. Say P is like 0.10, but you might notice there was an outlier. Like say you're doing a forced swim test, which is usually used to model behavioral despair, aka sort of depression in animals.
Okay.
Where you put the animal in basically a beaker of water, and you leave them in there for 5 to 10 minutes, depending on what you're running, and then you analyze it afterwards. And
that's dark.
And animals that are said to display more behavioral despair will just stop trying to get out. Animals that are considered controls or normals, or even animals that have been given antidepressants, will try to get out more. They'll be swimming around the bowl, and they'll be like, trying to escape. But the ones that are like have been just given chronic stress without any kind of intervention, they will just float there. Say there's a guy that, was just way off. I don't know. He just swam the whole time.
Right.
And that's making your control group average very high. So you cut that guy out and boom, it's statistically significant again.
Gotcha.
And there are certain rules. See, this is where like statistics are kind of tough. Like it's very convoluted because there are certain rules where you are supposed to cut out the outliers because it kind of messes with the sample.
So if you have the larger the sample size, the less those outliers will affect the overall control or the overall output.
Yes, exactly. So, but I mean, that's just the problem of having a large enough sample size because it's expensive to house animals. It's expensive to get some drugs. It's expensive to get procedure equipment. You got to pay people to be the staff and whatnot. So people usually try to go for the least amount possible that will still yield enough power for it to be statistically significant. And as far as the replicability, this might be a thing where it's kind of hard to see the forest from the trees. You know what? I'll say there are some. We had trouble, I know, replicating one risky decision task that another lab had done.
I think, isn't there like there's a less incentivization for replicating studies rather than creating your own?
It's half and half.
Right.
It's important to replicate, but if it's usually not completely replicating, it's usually you want to replicate their result and then like add something to it. But if you can't replicate the initial result, then it's calls into question the validity of the model to begin with. And then again, that comes back to the statistical analysis. It's like, well, you guys analyzed it a certain way.
Yeah, I think they had done some studies on delayed reward.
Delayed discounting?
Like something with like the kids and the cookies where they you told them to wait and like the kids.
Yeah. I think that would be like a delayed discounting task.
Yeah, I just remember them saying that the results from some of those studies haven't been able to be replicated. And there's a couple like really well-known popular studies that are no longer able to be considered valid because no one has replicated them in like 20 years or something.
Yeah, it's not something I think about really. It's more or less just trying to keep the current experiment like as controlled as possible, really. Like if it doesn't go through, then I mean you need a bigger sample size, really.
Gotcha.
You just need a bigger sample size. That's really the only answer. You got to run it again.
I think this information is kind of important because, especially today, where COVID is now going into the second wave of testing, and I don't think a lot of people understand what that means exactly. And I think the hospital that I work in is actually now starting to do that testing and how that kind of compares to what you do,
So do you mean for a vaccine?
Yes.
Oh, I know there's a couple different vaccines competing from what I heard. I heard one made it into phase 3 trials. I don't want to get wrong. I think it was AstraZeneca's. But there was a adverse event reported, which they had to put a pause on the whole thing and kind of figure out if it was like from the drug or from just something went wrong with the patient. Because I don't know how, like with clinical trials, they're really, really controlled.
Well, I mean, that's
in terms of
and that's
like health problems with the patient.
And that's kind of the thing with
so
outliers
like the guy
again,
could catch the flu.
Right.
Yeah, the guy could catch the flu, but they will put the whole trial on pause because they want to make sure that it's not from the drug.
Right. Contracting good science is hard because you have to make sure that all of your factors are accounted for, which is almost impossible in everyday life,
It is. And back to the thing with controlling, even like in the rat studies, like it's hard to control for everything, like housing conditions. They could be from different rat suppliers. If they decided to run the experiments during the rat's light cycle versus their dark cycle, like they might have just different baseline levels of activity, and it's important to control for all that. Yeah, it's a lot, and that's the purpose of publication too.
Right.
Like you got to be very, very detailed in the methods you used.
So there's two different avenues I want to kind of go down. So there's have you heard of the Rat Heaven, or I think it's called Rat Heaven?
Was it the RatPark?
Yeah, RatPark. That's it. So there's the RatPark, and then have you heard any of the conversations about telomeres related to rats and mice, lab mice, and like Brett Weinstein studies?
We can do the RatPark first.
Okay.
Yeah, I've heard of that, and I guess for listeners who aren't familiar with that, do you want to tell them?
Okay. Yeah, I'll give it my best shot. You can kind of correct me if I forget anything. But
for sure,
from my understanding, they kind of created the most ideal situation for a lab. Were they mice or were they rats?
I think they were rats in this study.
Okay. So they created the most ideal situation for rats, and which allowed, I think in most lab situations, the rats are kind of sectioned off by themselves or maybe one other rat. But in this situation, the rats were kind of put in like a large commune where they kind of cogwheeled out. So there was like kind of different cells, quote unquote, that went into a large community area where they could interact with each other. It was interesting, I think, that they kind of did drug studies revolving around like heroin and some of the harder drugs, and none of the rats seemed to be nearly as affected by the drug as compared to when they had the rat studies with lone rats by themselves.
Yeah, that's basically my understanding of it. And I was actually just looking it up to see what the metrics they used to kind of measure whether the rats were showing like self-administrative tendencies and whatnot. And I'm not entirely sure how they did this. It's saying on Wikipedia, this is just the first thing that popped up.
Sure.
In the RatPark, the rats could drink a fluid from one of two drop dispensers, which automatically recorded how much each rat drank, and one contained a sweetened morphine solution, and the other one plain tap water. So like even right there, you can kind of see sort of a discrepancy. Like the morphine solution was sweetened already, and the tap water was just plain tap water. And I mean, while morphine is going to be a greater, reinforcer than just regular sucrose. Sucrose in itself is a reinforcer anyway.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Is I think I had heard that same study talking about how sugar has addictive qualities as well, and people are less likely to overdo sucrose or sugar when they are in like joint communities. So it's kind of interesting that like depending on how you parse out the morphine or the sucrose, you can kind of decide how you want to kind of tell that story, which is interesting.
Right, and I wish I actually knew more about the actual methods they used, because yeah, I can see a lot of ways. I don't want to misquote the study itself, but if I remember right, they just put one group of rats was group housed in an enriched environment. So they had, toys, and they had each other, and like probably plenty of food. I don't know what all that entailed, but then if I recall right, the other group of rats was socially isolated. So not only did they not have enriched environments, they were also socially isolated. So it's kind of hard to parse out whether that was from a group effect or from a social effect also. And that might be something we can revisit maybe. I might look up that paper and maybe get back to you with an update on that.
We can always
I'm kind of curious about
follow
it
up, because I think
yeah,
because it seems like there's some interesting science there. I always liked that study because I think it from a story perspective, I think it makes sense in terms of how we have abuse of opiates currently in our society and in the United States. So it would make sense, as a lot of people do feel socially isolated. So
it's a very good social commentary, and the fact that it works. I think the issue with it is just that it wasn't controlled enough, that they can parse out the actual construct that's driving this disparity in morphine self-administration.
Yeah, we'll have to look up and see how replication studies might have compared to this one, and if they had similar results or not.
For sure, yeah.
And then the second point that I wanted to make was about Brett Weinstein.
Now, was it that telomeres in lab rats and lab mice, they were shortened?
Right.
They were shortened based on like generational inbreeding, and is that just compared to wild type, or not wild type, but because wild type is just like what
different
you call the
different companies
control one. Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean exactly. Yeah, that is a confound right there. Especially if you're trying to do genetic is where you'd notice it. Genetic studies is where you'd notice it, but who's to say that doesn't carry over?
Well, I mean, you might not control for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you might not control for it if you didn't know that it existed.
Yeah, that's a pretty recent finding, right? That's in the last year or two,
I'm pretty sure.
Think.
Well, at least it has been made more public, but it is interesting because it kind of indicates the systematic things that even scientists don't always account for. Where are we even getting this supply of test subjects? Because if you're getting it from a company that has basically created a new breed that reproduces quickly, that probably affects the DNA of that species and might even create a new breed of that animal that has some sort of long-lasting effect of their health.
Yeah. Yeah. Health behavior. I mean, that ties directly into epigenetics, which we're just starting now to understand anyway, like within the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, I think they kind of talked about how telomeres, that originally they thought that longer telomeres are better, but then they found that that's only because the ones that we were studying that had shorter telomeres were the rodents that were replicated to reproduce faster, and so it may be more of an indication of metabolism, because the shorter telomered rodents would reproduce faster and also more likely produce more cancers, which is abnormal for a field mouse or field rat.
Right. And I mean, that could be beneficial in some cases too, because, labs study cancer in rats. And if you want to study, like, there are knockouts, like transgenic rat lines. Are you familiar with, like, that concept?
No, I am not.
There are whole, like, subspecies of rats that scientists have created using kind of, not CRISPR. It's a popular one is the Flox-Lox system, and basically what it does.
Okay. Do they like glow in the dark or something?
That's one. Yeah, that's one thing that you can do with it. Basically, you either knock out a protein or you put a protein in, and they'll start expressing it, and you can even control the cell line in which will start expressing it. So, but like you could knock out a gene that like prevents cancer. I forget what they're called. Not oncogenes, or protein, but repressor proteins, or like insert an oncogene or something, and the mouse would start to get cancer. But like, yeah, I could see how, like, obviously if they could isolate a rat subspecies that had these short telomeres and was just more prone to cancer, and then breed them and keep that going, that would be an interesting way to look at a more, I guess, natural, quote unquote, way that in which cancer is produced.
Yeah, there's a lot of other confounding factors to that. So I don't know if they're able to factor out some of the other effects of creating mice that are more likely or more prone to have cancer, because I'm sure there's probably, I don't know what information you can get out of it besides the fact that like cancer is prevalent, so maybe like cancer cures and things like that.
Yeah, you could test cancer drugs, I don't know. Different chemotherapies. That's pretty much how they do kind of study it, because kind of by triggering oncogenes or taking out the repressor genes, because it's a better way to study it than just cutting the rat open and sticking a tumor inside it and seeing if the drug works on it then.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of ethics that go into that as well. Yeah, there are people that take care of that, so...
I think we're like at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to some of this stuff. It seems like we really are only getting a very slight grasp of how epigenetics, like you said, can affect the outcomes of the health of any organism that we interact with.
Yeah, but yeah, with the epigenetics, that field, even just neuroscience in general, I mean, epigenetics goes into all biological, physiological fields, but there's just so much we still don't know and stuff we're finding out. One of the big things that I studied in my old lab was the prevalence of glial cells and immune system interactions with the nervous system. And it really just influences human behavior and human behavioral pathologies in ways we didn't know. Like, for instance, whenever someone is stressed out, their blood-brain barrier kind of is easier to permeate it. So also your immune system is creating more cytokines, like inflammatory signals. So not only is your immune system creating more cytokines, those cytokines can more easily cross the blood-brain barrier. And then beyond that, there are your microglia, that are resident macrophages in the brain. And so this influx of cytokines is also activating these microglia. And the microglia then react like macrophages in the immune system do, and they start phagocytizing. And that's kind of leads...
Right.
Well, hypothetically, that is a big part of what leads or can contribute to symptoms of depression, in which, like, neuroscientists see dendritic spine loss, for which it's hard to say whether that's neuronally based.
Can you explain to everyone how phagocytosis works and kind of like the process of like those loss of...
So phagocytosis is just a general term for engulfing, and generally is used in the immune system in the peripheral sense, in which a white blood cell, or also I think they're also called macrophages, I believe I'm getting that right, targets a marked, either some marked foreign component in the body and just engulfs it and takes care of it. Basically, it's your immune defense. So so we also have macrophages that are in our brains and interact with our neurons, and they're called microglia. And in, like, you know, fully functioning, I guess, control type human brain, they are part of learning. Like, they're very much a part of early development. They kind of shape how the nervous system eventually wires from baby to adult. But then in adulthood, here's where it gets complicated, because it's
not well researched.
Yeah, and it's a growing field for sure, and it's a promising field.
Right.
But it's hard to say definitively what they do, because there's different accounts of what they do. But basically, they can be either inflammatory or more neutral. And in neutral, they're kind of keeping a balance. But whenever they become inflamed...
Right, they're like almost like the custodians of the brain.
They're overreacting. They're like phagocytizing more parts than they should, because usually they're just a cleanup crew. But they kind of go beyond being a cleanup crew. Hypothetically, this is a theory, but it's pretty well supported, and it was what I was studying, so I'm pretty biased towards it. But they go beyond, and they start just, overreacting. And therefore, there's more dendritic spine loss, and that it can possibly actually be what leads to the hyporeactivity of the prefrontal cortex in certain neurological conditions, or not neurological, but psychiatric, like depression.
Yeah, my question was, so I know that a lot of times there are indications of plaque buildup, and so the idea is that these glia are underperforming. Is there conditions
like
that are related,
Alzheimer's?
like you said? Yeah, exactly.
That's something that isn't well studied, but hypothetically, there's a good line of evidence that is leading people to look more into that. That's something that is currently being researched.
Yeah, I think I heard something about like Lewy bodies, which develop for Parkinson's as well, which like the plaque kind of builds up in different parts of the body, which has different effects on the like reaction outwardly in terms of symptoms.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly about the Lewy bodies. I know the Parkinson's is more loss of reactivity or loss of dopaminergic neurons. I know Alzheimer's for sure seems...
That's more of a frontal lobe one, right? Or no?
I wish I could say for sure, but I don't want to just wildly start guessing.
Postulate. Yeah, I get you. I know that they have done some research on trying to reactivate some of those areas of inactivity using shock therapy. They like are actually starting to reuse shock therapy. Like originally they did it in a very obtuse and rudimentary way, and so it kind of was believed that it didn't really work properly, but now they're creating more refined systems that actually seem to repress depression, because it seems to like allow for more connections to be made where there hadn't been for like between axons,
right?
Between nerves.
Exactly. That's kind of also the action of like ketamine, which is now being approved as a therapy for depression. And that's actually something I've looked at like under a microscope, the effects of ketamine like on dendritic cells. And it's like a visible difference when you count the spines that are on the neurons in the mice that have been dosed with ketamine versus the ones that just were control. Yeah, it causes, there's a whole, it triggers, so ketamine blocks the NMDA receptors. Man, I wish I could recite this from memory. But yeah, there's a whole
flashbacks.
Yeah, I'm getting flashbacks. I really am. That whole jogged a whole like portion of study in my memory. But yeah, there's a cascade of effects that definitely does lead to more neuroplasticity, which is a term that's kind of thrown around, but generally would refer to just the sending part of the cell sending out a burst of signals and the receiving part of the cell growing in reaction to that signal so those cells can then communicate better in the future. That's the general basis of neuroplasticity. And also the opposite, that's long-term potentiation. And there's also long-term depression, which is the opposite of that. And that's kind of just how learning takes place.
Right. Like you kind of have like a set pathway your neurons fire, and so they have a hard time sort of creating some different neural pathway that has like an alternate mindset, I suppose.
Yeah, right. It applies directly to like just depression in particular, since that's the example I've been using. Like,
right.
Yeah, people are kind of stuck in a set of behaviors and stuck in a mindset, and it directly mirrors, well, not directly mirrors, but I mean, it metaphorically mirrors the way that their actual physiological neurons are behaving in their brain.
I've even heard that they're implementing the use of delta waves to try to change the mindset of an individual, and it seems to like affect the way that glial cells interact and clear up the plaque of individuals, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the way neurons do, like when it comes down to it, they communicate through chemicals, but those chemicals are used to induce electrical signals. So if you could harness the right electrical signal, you're kind of just skipping the pharmacological concept. But I don't know a whole lot about electrophysiology. I think it's like theoretically
it's very
possible.
Cutting edge, right?
Yeah.
I think they've done some rat studies on like rats that have very recently started to develop plaque disease in their brains, but it's not like late stage, and that they've done some studies on using like alpha waves versus delta waves, which is like different, I guess, pulses of electricity to
different frequencies,
change,
kind of
different frequencies, vibrations, I guess.
Yeah, man, it's like I was saying, it's such a tip of the iceberg type of phenomenon with it. There's a lot of directions the research can go in, and luckily, I mean, it is going in a lot of those directions.
Right.
Yeah.
Even with Elon Musk,
Yeah, I know he's doing that Neuralink stuff. I'm not familiar with what exactly that is, though, honestly.
Yeah, I know that they had done some studies where they like plugged, I don't like, this is separate from Neuralink, but it is related, that they like plugged in some electrodes to a cat and then were able to somewhat display the images that a cat was able to see or something like that. I mean, it was very fuzzy, but they were able to like somehow get the optical nerves and then like translate it to a screen. But I have no idea how they were able to do that, but it's
I'm pretty sure that the way that the visual cortex is like laid out is kind of mapped directly onto how the retinas kind of receive and send images.
Right. It's like upside down and it like flips, right? It goes from left to right, right to left. And then the occipital lobe is in the back of the brain, right?
Yeah, I think it's like in the back top-ish. Well, the temporal lobe's the very back. Occipital is, I think, back top-ish.
Yeah, because I've heard that people who hit the back of their head sometimes go blind.
Yeah.
Which is insane. That
it is.
The back of your brain is where your eyeballs get their information. But I guess that's evolution at work, like we didn't really have developed forebrains until, modern day. So
True.
That kind of change. Like, I don't know if you saw they did this thing for to look at the nerve that goes into the speaker box. What's that called?
Is it
pharynx?
Yeah, I don't know what nerve that is.
It's the vagus nerve, I believe.
I know that's the one that's parasympathetic.
Right. I think from my understanding, you can actually follow the vagus nerve. It goes all the way up to the brain, and then it goes all the way back down to the throat. That it doesn't, like, it's very lackadaisical in its route to the pharynx, because it developed later after the vagus nerve had went. It's hard to describe, but I think it the vagus nerve goes all for the giraffe specifically. It goes all the way up or all the way down the neck of the giraffe, and then goes back up, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that it was. It kind of took that route. So
yeah, I think Richard Dawkins, he got a giraffe, and he somehow dissected it, and then he presented he showed the actual nerve going all the way down the giraffe, which is kind of cool.
That is. I didn't know Richard Dawkins
Physiology
actually did
well.
stuff. I knew he was a scientist, but I just thought he was kind of a just outspoken scientific philosopher, honestly.
Yeah, he kind of has gotten curmudgeoned in his later years, but he used to be kind of a he used to write some pretty interesting theories, and then also kind of would do some documentaries on the theory of evolution and
Darwinism and all that.
Yeah, Darwinism. Yeah.
Huh.
I'm sure we could talk about memes for another hour, but
I was just thinking of the South Park episode with Richard Dawkins in it. I don't know if you're familiar, but
I am not. Wait, is that the one where he falls in love with someone or something?
Yeah, I think he falls for Mrs. Garrison at that point. And there's a whole. It's all based on It's all a critique of atheism and
right.
Just hardball atheism and all that. Yeah.
Right. That's with the otters, right?
Yes, yeah, the otters in the future. Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Some people shit on South Park, but I have to say that they actually do have some decent commentary on current day events. Considering how quickly they produce some of that content, it's amazing that they're able to, have a interesting perception or an interesting take on what's happening that isn't just what modern society kind of views it,
Yeah, man. I'd say borderline genius, really.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen any of their documentaries or any of their interviews, but they work really well together because they kind of know what each of their roles are, and they don't really hold it against the other person. One guy's this guy's a genius and doing this stuff, and I wish I could have that ability, but I know what I'm good at, and so I'm gonna do this. And the other guy's yeah, I couldn't do it without this other guy. And it's just fascinating to see just the teamwork that you can kind of create when you have a really good symbiosis going.
Oh yeah, yeah. What's the documentary called? I haven't watched it. It's called 7 Days to Air, though, right?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, dude. I like their stuff. I watched Team America recently. That it's hilarious. It
still holds up, I'm sure.
It does.
I'm sure there's some weird bits with what did they do? They pushed it so far. Because they wanted the MPA to rate it, they wanted it to be rated X, so that they could they put in way more than they wanted, so that when they cut it for the second time, that they could get way more in than they really expected.
Yeah, I think I heard that on a Joe Rogan Experience. I think they wanted to have all the puppets have an orgy at the end, so they're no puppet orgy, but yes, you can have Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il musical number.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it was ridiculous.
Which, imagine like that whole what was that movie called with Seth Rogen that they like try to do the Kim Jong Il
Oh,
movie and like it totally got canceled. Like it's like completely different, you know?
the interview. I didn't know it got
Was
edited.
that
I
it? Yeah,
thought they just
they
did it.
canceled it.
Cancel? What do you mean they canceled it?
They like stopped it from releasing in theaters. I'm pretty sure they made it a digital
Oh,
release.
interesting. I, I wonder if they were honestly scared of like retributory kind of
I think they
attacks.
were, which is like ironic considering how far
Yeah.
Team America went. Like,
Well,
I
I
mean,
don't
I
think
think they made
anybody.
fun of
I,
like everyone so hard.
yeah, I mean they went after like a lot of famous actors, like Alec Baldwin, mainly
And Matt
the
Damon.
most. Yeah, Matt. It's Matt Damon. And if you haven't, if nobody's seen the movie, they won't get that. But
uh,
yeah,
if you have
yeah,
a if you have a hard stomach, we recommend you watch Team America.
yeah,
There is some puppet vomiting at some points.
yes, that happens. Yeah, it's not a kids movie, despite the puppets.
No,
No,
despite the puppets.
despite the puppets.
So okay, while we when we start to wind down, I think I want to ask you again if you have any other form of news that we didn't really talk about that you kind of use regularly that kind of give you a feel for where people are kind of getting their perceptions from or getting their hot takes from.
I think we covered it pretty well for me in the last podcast. Honestly, in the last week, yeah, stuff that shows up on YouTube, if it looks
Yeah.
interesting, kind of headlines in different email chains I'll get. And, if I get, like, bored in my hands to start wondering, I will make myself over to Reddit and kind of just browse the
Mm.
front page. So if something winds up there, um, honestly, I feel like I'm not as up to date as I could be. Like, I think when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I actually heard of it in like a group chat. Someone posted something like before I actually
It's probably
saw a
me.
news. Yeah, I think it was you actually. It's either you or Ian. Yeah.
The only reason I saw it was because I was dropping a patient off at the hospital, and they have a TV in there, and I looked up and it said,
Mm,
um, you know, dead at 87 or whatever, and I'm like, oh shit, like
yeah.
that's huge news, you know.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny that how that's huge news. Like 86-year-old dies. Like,
Well, I mean, yeah, when you have a for life term
right.
justice, you know, then like yeah, like whenever any of them die, I mean, like the same thing. I mean, not the same exact thing, but like it was pretty big news when Justice Scalia died in 2016.
Yeah. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on I know it's been a big story lately. Um
Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy because in 2016, if you haven't really been following politics, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Right now, it's actually 5-4. There are more conservative justices than liberal justices, but there is kind of like is this Justice Kennedy who kind of tries to keep a median balance for kind of trying to keep the peace so it doesn't get too out of hand. But now that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died, it's kind of gonna be if Donald Trump gets his way, it'll be a 6-3 majority conservative Supreme Court, which means that any liberal perspective, liberal
even just
ideology
bills.
on the law,
Just yeah.
yeah, won't really be interpreted and might actually be taken down. The largest one being the American Healthcare Act, the quote unquote Obamacare that actually at the beginning of 2021 they're actually supposed to take a case regarding the American Healthcare Act and how that will kind of end up in like the state of the law with the Supreme Court because they're looking at how what's it called when you have like a condition that
pre-existing.
Yeah, like they're going to be looking at pre-existing health conditions and how whether that's constitutional to have insurance companies having to take those people under coverage even if they are like too expensive to economically handle or something like that.
That's kind of fucked up, Like it's not a car.
Well, I mean, yeah.
I know you're not saying it is, but just the whole concept, it's not like it's totaled.
Yeah. From my perspective, if you look at healthcare currently, if you get shot and you like dump the body at the front door of the hospital and they see it, the hospital automatically has to treat that person just because of, do no harm. Like a lot of the philosophy of the healthcare system is to treat anyone that comes through the doors, regardless of whether they can pay for it or if they have any sort of insurance. So if you want to look in terms of saving money, you actually want to make sure that the coverage the care that you're applying doesn't only impact acute circumstances, because it actually makes it more likely for admittances to be of emergent situations, acute situations that could have been treated earlier but weren't because they couldn't afford the longer term care that is required to prevent the acute event. An example of that would be, for example, this is the one that I always use, but I think it's a really good indication of how fucked up the American healthcare system is. Erectile dysfunction is actually one of the first few indications of heart disease that kind of appears. And rather than treat the heart disease and change lifestyle outcomes for that individual, we just treat the symptoms, which are unable to gain an erection. So we now just give them a blue pill and it makes them erect, even though in the long term it won't actually fix them in the health outcomes that we really are trying to prevent, which is like ICU care and things like that.
Slow down, man. I'm trying to get a sponsorship from Blue Chew. You might want to cut that last part.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Listen, like if there are other situations where you could have erectile dysfunction, but a lot of times it's people who are overweight that need to like do other things, and if you have a good doctor that won't give you the prescription, it's probably because they want you to try to lose 10 or 15 pounds before you attempt to just take a pill that will quote unquote solve your whatever issue that you have. So
right.
That's kind of where I'm looking at. The same thing with like diabetes or pre-diabetic diagnoses where, rather than giving someone insulin, you try to reduce their sugar intake and you have them go on a diet to make it so that they don't actually have to take supplemental insulin.
Yeah, right? Plus exactly what you're saying, whatever underlying conditions or lifestyle.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, hypertension too, you don't want their kidneys to fail and then go on dialysis.
Yeah. Because the drugs are only going to be effective for so long. They're going to build a tolerance to it, and unless they make other changes.
If you make it,
yeah,
and if you make it cheaper for people to get that type of healthcare, then we won't have to. Healthcare overall won't be as expensive. I don't know. That's kind of my 2 cents on the situation. I think
I agree with you. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think it's overall kind of ridiculous that we're having a debate whether we should have in the next 2 months, less than 2 months before an election, we're trying to decide if we want to elect someone who's going to be in charge of making these decisions for life. It seems like that kind of decision should be made in a longer time span. There never has been a Supreme Court justice confirmed in this short amount of time, and having a lame duck president nominate a justice just seems against the ethics and intentions of what the Founding Fathers established these ideologies and philosophies off of from the Constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even so I don't know if you know what happened with Justice Scalia, but Mitch McConnell. So he had basically said that they can't confirm Merrick Garland because it was within a year of it being an election, so they couldn't confirm them because the American people have a right to decide who the justice was going to be. That's literally never been
right 4 years ago.
Yeah, that literally was nothing
On
that
record.
had been a conversation before then. But fine, if that's the way you wanted it to be. Like Merrick Garland had literally like 666 days. Like I think it was like basically a little bit under a year or something like that they had to confirm them, but they decided to kind of drag their feet because they wanted to confirm a conservative justice, which is kind of ridiculous, but fine if that's the way you want to play. But to be completely hypocritical and contradict yourself to elect another one within the span of 2 months, politically, I think is actually suicidal. Like, I don't think that most people want them to confirm someone before the next election.
I don't know, man. I don't think a lot of anybody who isn't really very conservative leaning, and or Trump, very, very down with Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. The issue is the person they've kind of suggested seems like is just like religious nut.
Yeah.
In my what I've seen, like part of some, I'm not sure exactly what it is called. I'm not gonna I'm not trying to build up a straw man and call it cultish and stuff. That's a lifestyle. It's a legit lifestyle, and people are entitled to those opinions. It just, I don't know, just forcing religious opinions on others. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but the fact that they might even try to call into question Roe v. Wade.
Right, exactly.
Taking in women's health.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more than women's health. It's a whole economic issue. If you can't raise a child, then
right. Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Is the state to try to force you to?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a woman independence thing, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It'll be curious to see what happens. I think that these next 2 months are going to be pretty wrought with a lot of controversy, and it's already been a pretty interesting year. So keep your ears out and let us know if you hear anything. I don't know. It does seem like we live in very, very interesting times.
They are indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was one other thing I wanted to talk about with the justice, the way the Supreme Court is laid out, and how Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of changed the way that we kind of look at the Supreme Court. She was someone that is powerfully influential. I think that if anyone would want a role model, I couldn't think of anyone better than that woman. She led the charge in a lot of different fascinating and new thinking ways. And even when she had passed away and when Trump had gotten off of some sort of plane, they had interviewed him, and he hadn't heard of it, I don't think, when he had gotten off the plane. And he actually genuinely looked surprised, and he didn't actually have anything bad to say about her. He kind of was like, yeah, say what you want about her. She was opinionated, and she wanted to get her perspective across. And when Donald Trump, who I don't personally think is very politically savvy or politically educated in our history, even when he can say that about someone, I think it really goes a long way to prove that they kind of walk the walk and talk the talk of what their philosophy was. Just to kind of highlight one of the major things that she did, there was and this might seem kind of trivial today, but she kind of led the movement for women's rights. And the way she did this was by calling something unconstitutional, which seems actually like a men's rights issue. But what you don't realize is that by calling something a men's right issue, it then puts into question anything that is quote unquote to protect a woman's interest. So this case was about, I think it was in Wisconsin or something like that. I'll clarify in the future, but there was 2 different drinking ages for women and men, and women were able to buy alcohol before men. So the men would just ask women to buy alcohol for them for like their dates or something like that. Well, so then the ACA, or I forget what they're called, it's like a rights advocate. They came up to these guys that sued because they said that it was unfair for women to be able to get alcohol before men, and it came onto her desk because if you are able to say that you can't protect, or you can't infer that women are able to handle their alcohol better than men can, then you could say the opposite, that women can't be protected by laws because of they are quote unquote the fairer sex. So she made a lot of moves to try to have women come from behind the veil of quote unquote civil society to allow women to make the choice of being influential in modern society and no longer segmented and sequestered to like home life.
Right on. Yeah.
I wish I personally knew more about her, because I feel like she really had a lot of powerful speeches and a lot of powerful words. But maybe I'll try to get some other people on here that might know a little bit about her. If anyone wants to comment about her, we'd love to hear or read from any of you that have a nuanced perspective of the current event.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that she does have either a biography or a memoir that has been published. I'm not sure what it's called, but I think I've seen it on Audible. So,
all right, I think we kind of covered everything that I wanted to cover there, Matthew. I think this is a good second episode.
Yeah, man, good talking with you.
Yeah, this was fun. I think we're getting better at this for sure.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
I
didn't realize how much time already passed.
Yeah, time flies, We'll be like Joe Rogan and doing 3 hours in no time.
Bring it on. You bring the DMT.
I actually met someone that said that they would be willing to do a podcast with me on Friday, so I might be recording 2 this week and trying to kind of segment these out so that we have content whenever we don't have a podcast on hand, if we ever have to take a break or something.
Right on, man. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody, and let us know if we missed anything, or if you have any opinions on any of the subjects that you talked about. Anything you want to say to the people there, Matthew?
Not really. Yeah, just take care, folks. Hope you all are having a great day.
All right. Peace, love. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.